வணக்கம். எங்களுடன் இணைந்ததற்கு நன்றி. இந்த அமர்வு நேரடியாக வெப்காஸ்டிங் செய்யப்படுகிறது. webcast.fiu.edu. இந்த அமர்வு ஒளிப்பதிவும் செய்யப்படுகிறது. புளோரிடா FIU தமிழ் மற்றும் புலம்பெயர் தமிழ் ஆய்வு நிறுவனத்தின் முதல் தமிழ் வள்ளுவர் கருத்தரங்குக்கு தாங்கள் அனைவரையும் வரவேற்பதில் மிகுந்த மகிழ்ச்சி அடைகிறோம். எனது பெயர் கலைமதி. நான் FIUவில் உள்ள ஹெர்பர்ட் வர்த்தாய் மருத்துவக் கல்லூரியில் மூலக்கூறு, நுண்ணுயிரி மற்றும் தொற்று நோய்கள் துறை பேராசிரியராக பணிபுரிகிறேன். கடந்த 23 ஆண்டுகளாக FIUடன் இணைந்து பயணித்துக் கொண்டிருக்கிறேன். புரட்சிக்கவி பாரதிதாசன் அவர்களிடமிருந்து தமிழ்க்குயில் பட்டம் பெற்ற தமிழறிஞர் கவிஞர் முனைவர் கலியபெருமாள் அவர்களின் 2வது புதல்வி. மலேசிய பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் இளங்கலை மற்றும் முதுகலை பட்டம் பெற்று யூனிவர்சிட்டி ஆஃப் டென்னசி மெம்பிஸ் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் முனைவர் பட்டமும் சமீபத்தில் உடல் நலம் மற்றும் கொள்கை மேலாண்மை மற்றும் பொது சுகாதார முதுகலை பட்டத்தை பெற்றேன். சமுதாயத்தின் பெரும் பங்குடன் FIUவில் தமிழ் மற்றும் புலம்பெயர்ந்தோர் தமிழர் ஆய்வு நிறுவனம் நிறைவேறும் என்பதில் பெருமை கொள்கிறேன். நிச்சயமாக இது நமது கலாச்சாரம் மற்றும் பாரம்பரியத்திற்கான அழுத்தமான ஒரு பதிவாக அமையும். இன்று இந்த இடத்தில் நாம் அனைவரும் நிற்பதற்கு பலருக்கு நான் நன்றி சொல்ல கடமைப்பட்டிருக்கிறேன். குறிப்பாக மிக பெரும் ஆதரவு அளித்த பேராசிரியர் எரிக் லார்சன் அவர்கள். மலேசிய கவிஞர் சீனா நைனா முகமது அவர்களின் நிலை பெற நீ வாழியவை தழுவிய வாழ்த்து கவிதையை புலம்பெயர் தமிழ் கீதமாக மாற்றி கலைமாமணி சிக்கல் குருச்சரன் இசையமைத்து அவர்களின் இனிமையான குரலில் இப்பொழுது வழங்கப்படும்.
காப்பியனை ஈன்றவளே, காப்பியங்கள் கண்டவளே, காப்பியனை ஈன்றவளே, காப்பியங்கள் கண்டவளே, கலை வளர்த்த தமிழகத்தின் தலைநிலத்தில் ஆள்பவளே, கலை வளர்த்த தமிழகத்தின் தலைநிலத்தில் ஆள்பவளே, தாய் புலமையார் புவியில் தனி பெருமை கொண்டவளே, தாய் புலமையார் புவியில் தனி பெருமை கொண்டவளே, தமிழரோடு புலம் பெயர்ந்து தரணி எங்கும் வாழ்பவளே, தமிழரோடு புலம் பெயர்ந்து தரணி எங்கும் வாழ்பவளே, புலம்பெயர் தமிழர் வாழ் எக்கண்டத்திலுமே இலக்கியமாய் வழக்கியலாய் இனக்காவல் தருபவளே, புலம்பெயர் தமிழர் வாழ் எக்கண்டத்திலுமே இலக்கியமாய் வழக்கியலாய் இனக்காவல் தருபவளே, பொங்கி வளர் அறிவியலில் புத்தாக்கம் அத்தனைக்கும் பொருந்தி இன்று மின் உலகில் புரட்சி வலம் வருபவளே, செவ்வியலின் இலக்கியங்கள் செழித்திருந்த பொற்காலம் சேர்த்து வைத்த செய்யுள் வளத்தில் செம்மாந்த பழையவளே, செவ்வியலின் இலக்கியங்கள் செழித்திருந்த பொற்காலம் சேர்த்து வைத்த செய்யுள் வளத்தில் செம்மாந்த பழையவளே, அவ்வியலில் வேரூன்றி அறிவுயர்ந்த அழகழகாய் உரை நடையும் ஆளுகின்ற புதியவளே, அவ்வியலில் வேரூன்றி அறிவுயர்ந்த அழகழகாய் உரை நடையும் ஆடுகின்ற புதியவளே, குலங்கடந்து நெறி கடந்து நிலவரம்பின் தடை கடந்து கோமகளாய் தமிழர் மனம் கொலுவிருக்கும் தமிழனங்கே, குலங்கடந்து நெறி கடந்து நிலவரம்பின் தடை கடந்து கோமகளாய் தமிழர் மனம் கொலுவிருக்கும் தமிழனங்கே நிலவினுக்கே பெயர்ந்தாலும் நினதாட்சி தொடரும் அம்மா நிலவினுக்கே பெயர்ந்தாலும் நினதாட்சி தொடரும் அம்மா நிறை குறையா செம்மொழியே நிலை பெற நீ வாடியவே நிறை குறையா செம்மொழியே நிலை பெற நீ வாடியவே 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 நிலை பெற நீ வாடியவே நிலை பெற நீ வாடியவே வாடியவே.
Thank you, Kalaimamani Sikkal Gurucharan, for the soulful rendition. Kalaimamani Sikkal Gurucharan, ஆத்மார்த்தமான அன்னை தமிழ் தாய் வாழ்த்தை தந்தமைக்கு மிக்க நன்றி. 1969 ஆண்டில் சான் பிரான்சிஸ்கோ மாகாணம் அமெரிக்கான ஆர்வலர் ஜான் மெக்கானல் யுனெஸ்கோ சந்திப்பு கூட்டத்தில் நாம் வாழும் உலகத்திற்கு நன்றி செலுத்தும் மற்றும் மதிப்பறியும் நாளாக ஒரு நாளை தேர்ந்தெடுக்க வேண்டும் என்று முன்மொழிந்தார். இந்த உலக தினமானது எதிர்கால சந்ததிக்கான சுற்றுச்சூழலை பேணி பாதுகாத்து மேம்படுத்தும் விழிப்புணர்வை அதிகரிக்க கவனம் செலுத்த ஏற்படுத்தப்பட்டது. முதன்முறையாக 53 ஆண்டுகளுக்கு முன்னால் இதே நாள் ஏப்ரல் 22ஆம் தேதி ஆரம்பிக்கப்பட்டது. தற்போது உலகளாவிய அளவில் பல நிகழ்வுகள் Earthday.org ஒருங்கிணைக்கப்பட்டு சிறப்பாக நடைபெற்று வருகின்றன. 2000 ஆண்டுகளுக்கு முன்பு வாழ்ந்த வள்ளுவர் என்றும் திருவள்ளுவர் தமிழ் உலகத்தால் அறியப்பட்ட பெருநாவலர் உலகத்தை பாதுகாப்பதில் மிகுந்த அக்கறை கொண்டு பூமி பந்தை பேணுவதையும் மேம்படுத்துவதை பற்றியும் தன் குரட்பாக்கில் ஈரடி மந்திரமாயும் வழங்கியிருக்கிறார். இந்த திருக்குறள் 20க்கும் மேற்பட்ட மொழிகளில் மொழிபெயர்க்கப்பட்டுள்ளது. முதலாவது லத்தீன் மொழியில் கான்ஸ்டான்டினியஸ் ஜோசப் ஃபெஸ்கி, அதாவது வீரமாமுனிவர் என்று அழைக்கப்படும் தமிழ் ஆர்வலர் எழுதி 1730ஆம் ஆண்டில் வெளியிடப்பட்டது. திருவள்ளுவரை பற்றியும் திருக்குறளை பற்றியும் பேசுவதற்கு திரு தாமஸ் ஹிட்டோஷி புருக்ஸ்மாவை தேர்வு செய்ய வெகு நேரம் எடுக்கவில்லை. தாமஸ் ஹிட்டோஷி புருக்ஸ்மா எழுத்தாளர், மொழிபெயர்ப்பாளர், ஆசிரியர் மற்றும் கலைஞர் என பன்முக வித்தகர். உலகில் வாழும் பழமையான நகரமான மதுரையில் தமிழ் பேசவும் படிக்கவும் எழுதவும் கற்றுக்கொள்ள 5 ஆண்டுகளே செலவிட்டார். திருக்குறளின் எளிமை, புதினம், உலக கோட்பாடுகள் அவர் மனத்தை கவர்ந்தன. 2022ஆம் ஆண்டு அவரது திருவள்ளுவரின் திருக்குறள் மொழிபெயர்ப்பு புத்தகம் வெளியிடப்பட்டது. இவரது மற்ற புத்தகங்களில் ஒன்று ஔவையார் கவிதைகள் மொழிபெயர்ப்பு ஆகும். மேலும் இவர் ஆங்கில இலக்கணத்தை மிக எளிய வழியில் கற்பித்து வருகிறார். தாமஸ் கலைக்கான தேசிய உதவித்தொகை ஃபார் கலாச்சாரம் கலைஞர் அறக்கட்டளை மற்றும் USA ஃபுல்பிரைட் திட்டத்திலிருந்து மானியங்கள் மற்றும் ஃபெலோஷிப்கள் பெற்றுள்ளார். புளோரிடா பன்னாட்டு பல்கலைக்கழகம் தமிழ் மற்றும் புலம்பெயர் ஆய்வுகள் நிறுவன சார்பாக திரு தாமஸ் ஹிட்டோஷி புருக்ஸ்மாவை இன்று உங்களுக்கு வழங்குவதில் நான் மிகவும் மகிழ்ச்சி அடைகிறேன்.
Thank you, Kalai, and thank you everyone for being here. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Since I know we have a number of Tamil speakers here today, I wanted to begin with a greeting in Tamil, which I'll go on to translate into English. பணிவாகிய பெருமை பெற்ற பெரியவர்களே, முகந்தெரியா விருந்தோம்பி மகழும் தாய்மார்களே, நவல்தோறும் நூல்நயம் போலும் நண்பர்களே, மெழுதும் ஆகிய கூழையாளாவிய சிறு கைப்பற்ற குழந்தைகளே, அனைவருக்கும் என் அன்பான பணிவான வணக்கங்கள். To the great, whose greatness is the greatness of humility, to those who raise us up and welcome guests with joyful faces, to friends who, like great books, grant ever-growing delight, and to children who give us the sweetness of ambrosia in the food their tiny hands may scatter, to everyone my humble and heartfelt thanks. I am delighted today to speak about the Kurol, the Tirukkural of Thiruvalluvar, and its profound ecological sensibility. Although I know some of you are already familiar with this work, I know others of you are not, and so I'll speak assuming that you have no previous knowledge about the subject. Also, since my chief aim in translating the Tirukkural was and remains to introduce the work to an English-speaking audience, to English-speaking readers who may never have heard of it before and may not even have heard of the Tamil language before, I will be speaking primarily in English. But of course, during the Q&A, if there are questions that people want to speak in Tamil, I will respond to those questions in Tamil and then also respond to them in English as well. அப்போ வந்து தமிழ்ல ஒரு கேள்வி கேட்கணும்னா தமிழ்ல கேட்கலாம், அதுக்கு தமிழ்லையும் ஆங்கிலத்திலையும் பதில் தர்றேன். One less prefatory remark. I spent more than 5 years translating the Tirukkural, and more than 15 years prior to that becoming able to do so in the first place, not only in terms of my understanding of Tamil, but also in terms of my capacity as a poet and writer in English. And at the heart of the questions that mattered to me most, right from the time that I was an undergraduate student of philosophy, majoring in and specializing in environmental and ecological ethics, right to my present day work as a poet and writer, translator, and teacher, one of the things that concerned me most and concerns me most is how we are to live in a time as troubled as our own. Troubled politically, socially, and also, of course, ecologically and agriculturally. And about these matters, Thiruvalluvar has and remains astonishingly relevant. And so what I'd like to share are 10 comments, 10 observations about what the Tirukkural has to say about ecological ethics. This is not a comprehensive account, but this is a kind of introductory invitation to explore the work of this really extraordinary poet. So first, a little context. The Tirukkural comprises 133 chapters, and these 133 chapters, each with 10 very short verses on a particular topic, are divided into 3 sections or 3 books. The first section is on what we could call ethics or virtue or right living. The second section is on politics, wealth, the life of a community. And the third section is on love, the ways of love in the heart, the ways of love, romantic love, but also the love of people who are in committed relationships. Now, in the first section of the Tirukkural on virtue, ethics, right living, the first 4 chapters of that section, which are of course the first 4 chapters of the work as a whole, form a kind of introduction to the work of the whole as a whole. The first of these chapters can be interpreted in at least 3 distinct ways. It can be interpreted as in praise of God, a singular God with various qualities. It can be interpreted as in praise of the gods, and it can also be interpreted as in praise of the godlike qualities of human teachers, spiritual teachers. And of course, if we wanted to discuss the first chapter alone, we could have not just a talk, but a whole series of talks on that very important chapter. But what I want to draw our attention to is that the very next chapter, the second chapter in the entire work, is on the glory of rain. The very placement of this chapter suggests that the glory of rain is second only to the glories of divinity, however we may understand divinity. And this chapter is on the glory of rain, not just as a kind of independent entity, but as the entire cycle of rain, the entire cycle, the entire ecological cycle, which allows life to exist on Earth. So I wanted to share a few tastes of this first chapter from my translation to give a sense of the context for the way that Thiruvalluvar, the ecological sensibility that really flows through the work as a whole. I'll read each of these verses that I share twice. One of the beautiful things about the Tirukkural, one of the beautiful chapters, is on the art of listening. And so we get to cultivate the art of listening together. And I do each verse twice because sometimes when we listen to poetry, there can be a temptation to worry immediately about, what is the meaning of this verse. So I invite you the first time to simply listen to the music of the words, which even in the English translations, I've tried to capture something of the music, some of the poetic qualities of the original Tamil. And then the second time, you can also be attending to the meaning of those words. The first of the 10 verses in the chapter on the glory of rain goes like this. Because rain gives us the world, fitting to know it as ambrosia. Because rain gives us the world, fitting to know it as ambrosia. Now, this word ambrosia, or the elixir of life, is that drink which brings everlasting life. So we are in a cosmic, mythic sort of realm with a word like ambrosia, just as we are if we look at ambrosia in the Greek or elixir in the Latin. And yet notice what Tiruvalluvar has done. He has taken this extraordinary ambrosia, this extraordinary elixir, and says, look, it is here, right here, all around us in the rain that falls from the sky, which announces, I think, one of the most distinctive features of the Tirukkural, which is its insistent practicality, its insistent interest in the ins and outs of worldly life, earthly existence, and how we are to live on the very earth itself. And by using this word ambrosia, amritam, elixir, we are invited to see how, in fact, rain is this life-giving substance over time immemorial, because this rain really does, as he puts it, give us the world, give us the possibility of this living world. And this verse is followed immediately by the second verse in the chapter, the 12th verse in the Tirukkural, which says about rain, making food fit for feeding, and itself food that feeds. Rain. Making food fit for feeding, and itself food that feeds. Rain. Rain is not only that which allows food to grow, makes it possible for food to grow, it is itself a nourishment. And I should note that this particular verse happens to be one of the very first verses that I learned by heart, because and I'll share the Tamil with you, because it has an extraordinary playful quality to it. And the sound of the verse itself suggests the sound, to my ear, the sound of rain falling. Tuparka tupaya tupaki, tuparka tupaya dumare. Really an extraordinary verse, with an extraordinary understanding of this, the importance of water, but conveyed through playful and really unforgettable poetry. And then this proceeds to the third of these 10 verses, which goes like this. If skies fail to rain, hunger racks the wide earth, surrounded on all sides by seas. If skies fail to rain, hunger racks the wide earth, surrounded on all sides by seas. Now, there's something very interesting for me in this verse, because we have this phrase, the wide earth surrounded on all sides by seas. You can imagine a great continent surrounded by the oceans on the sides. And this is a kind of phrase which a person can be tempted to read as a kind of stock phrase, a kind of poetic phrase. We see this phrase throughout the great Sangam literature and from there into the present. However, a great poet like Tiruvalluvar, the analogy that I think of, or the analogous poet I think of in the context of English literature would be Shakespeare, never uses a phrase like that without a profound understanding of all of the connotations of such a phrase. And I think there's such an extraordinary both awareness and irony in this usage, because you can imagine, here we are on, on all of us on our various continents, surrounded by the sea. But if the rain doesn't come from above, all of that water cannot nourish us. That salt water will not grow the crops. That salt water will not nourish us, will not quench our thirst. So there is again this sense of the understanding of the entire cycling of life, that the water has to be brought up into the clouds, and then the dark clouds have to gather and fall upon the land and nourish the land and return to the sea. And this cycle is ongoing, ever present, and ever important. And I'll share one more verse. We could spend, in fact, the whole time just on this chapter alone, but I want to spend one more verse, share one more verse from this chapter, the last verse of the chapter, because there's something very important in that verse I want to explore with you. The verse goes like this. It's kind of encapsulating verse, which says, "No being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain. No being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain." And here Thiruvalluvar points our attention to the fact that, without rain, nothing else can happen. Nothing else no other events can flow in the world. Now, this word that I've translated as flow in Tamil is orike, which can also be translated as conduct, right action. But I've used the word flow both because the root of that word, the vigudi, pagadi, I should say, of orike, has to do with, among other things, the way that water flows, particularly the way water flows with something else, the way water flows, for instance, through land. And Thiruvalluvar here is making a beautiful connection between the way that water flows through our world, ecologically, and the way that conduct can also flow through us, the way great conduct, the way that conduct flows, if you will, from a person of character, flows in a way that is akin to the flowing of water on earth, adapting itself perfectly to the terrain at the same time that it changes that terrain. Just like a Shakespeare, Thiruvalluvar writes with an extraordinary awareness of all of the meanings of every word that he uses, and all of those meanings are present in every usage. So that's my first comment. And the second one follows from it, which is that this ecological sensibility includes in itself the question of right action. This ecological sensibility becomes the proper context for right action. For instance, the immediately following verse, the first verse of the third chapter, goes like this. Good books agree. The great let go in that way which is theirs. Now, this is a chapter on the greatness of letting go, on the greatness of people who are able to renounce. Ascetics would be a more conventional interpretation or translation. Listen again to the verse. Good books agree. The great let go in that way which is theirs. Now here the word I've translated as way comes from the same root as the word for flow that we've just seen in the previous verse. And so there is a sense in which just as water flows through the earth, fitting the land that it touches, so too can a human being live in that way which is uniquely suited to them. And that these two possibilities are related at the root, that there are indeed as many, there are, as just as there are many landscapes, there are many ways of living, all of which can be nourishing to the earth, all of which can be nourishing to human community. A third comment. Both for the earth and for human life, the question, the supreme ecological question, is therefore the question of fit. How does an action fit a particular person? How does an action fit a particular place in this living world? And so the last verse of the fourth chapter, so the last verse of the sort of introductory 4 chapters to the work, puts it with deceptive simplicity by saying, action that fits is virtue. Action that doesn't is vice. Such extraordinary simplicity. Action that fits is virtue. Action that doesn't is vice. And we can read that verse standing on its own, and we could assume, for instance, that, well, action that fits means action that fits a particular person, that fits a certain circumstance, and we could end there in the realm of the social sphere, sphere of community. However, Thiruvalluvar asks us, his work asks us to read ecologically, to read a verse like this in the context of, say, the chapters that have just preceded it, so that action that fits is not just action that fits a person. It is also action that fits the world itself. It fits the world with its cycles of rain, so that this question of fit becomes of paramount importance. In fact, the work as a whole really can put into an entirely different perspective the way we think about ethics, particularly in the West, and particularly in the tradition of contemporary analytic philosophy. The Tirukkural offers something that is akin to what the Canadian poet, philosopher, and musician Jan Zwicky has called lyric philosophy. And this is something we can discuss at greater length in the Q&A if there are people who are interested. Here is my fourth point. This ability to conduct oneself in a way that fits with the world is at the heart of the question not only of human conduct and human ethics, but also at the nature of what it means to learn. What does it mean to know something? Indeed, I took the title for this talk from the 10th verse of Thiruvalluvar's chapter on the possession of conduct. Now, this word conduct, in fact, again comes from that same root as the word we spoke about earlier, flow, way, the way that water moves inland. So this last verse of these 10 on the possession of conduct says, those who can't flow with the world, even if learned, they know nothing. Those who can't flow with the world, who can't conduct themselves in accordance with the world, who can't conduct themselves in harmony with the world, cannot be one with the world. Those who can't flow with the world, even if learned, they know nothing. Without this harmony, without this flowing, without this oneness, no matter what or how much a person or a people or a civilization indeed may have learned, they actually don't know anything, because they've forgotten the basis for the possibility of knowledge, the basis for the possibility of human conduct. So as I hope you're starting to see, right through from the very beginning and weaving its way, flowing, if you will, its way through this entire work is this fundamental concern with what does it mean to live well on this earth with its cycles and with other people. And I really want to take a moment here to applaud Florida International University for creating a forum like this in which to discuss these matters which are so supremely important. Here's my fifth point. So far, we've looked at key verses from the first part of the Tirukkural on ethics, virtue, right action. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that section soon enough. But before that, I want to turn to the second section of the Kural, which is about politics, power, wealth, the true meanings of wealth. Because here we can see how the Kural's insights into conduct, reign, and the nature of knowledge reverberate in the realm of community. And perhaps the verse that most clearly encapsulates this reverberation comes from the chapter on good rule, good governance, in which Thiruvalluvar says, where kings rule, as wisdom decrees, rain and harvest abound. Of course, I'm using the traditional language of kings, but we can listen to a verse like this in the present day and think, a ruler, a leader of any kind, a leader of a country, the leader of an organization, a leader of a family. Where kings rule as wisdom decrees, rain and harvest abound. Now, just a few decades ago, perhaps before we had an Earth Day, this kind of verse might be read as a sort of superstition. Well, what would be the connection between rulers, leaders ruling wisely and rain and harvest? How are these things connected? But I think now we can see that they are indeed deeply connected, that the way that we conduct ourselves as communities, as countries, has everything to do with the way that our natural world functions, the way our climate shelters us or does not shelter us, the way our climate gives us the possibility for food or endangers that very possibility. And that, the real superstition is the thought, the belief that people can do whatever they want without regard for the ecological consequences of their actions. That is the real superstition, I would argue, that we suffer now, every day, all of us, in our current times. For we see now that our human actions do affect even the rain, and this in turn infects even our capacity to grow food, a link that Tirabalibar established all the way back there in chapter 2, and continues in his verses on farming, which is the subject of my 6th comment. Tirabalibar turns our attention to a topic which, alas, I think is often neglected, which is the topic of agriculture, and how this essential art connects with everything else on earth. For example, the 2nd verse in the chapter on farming puts it, I think, extraordinarily clearly. He says, "Farmers sustain everyone not farming. They are the pin holding the world together." Farmers sustain everyone not farming. They are the pin holding the world together. So here we can see the importance not only of farming and farmers who hold indeed the world, our world, together, but that everybody else involved in all sorts of other noble professions and endeavors depend on them for their lives. A dependence which is, I think, alas, often overlooked. And so we can see that Tiruvallur is kin, is colleague to people such as the poet and farmer Wendell Berry, or Vandana Shiva in the Indian context, who are reminding us of the same kind of importance, the same fundamental importance of agriculture, of ecological and sustainable agriculture to the larger predicament that we face. And we can also see how Tiruvallur connects the question of farming with the question of what does it mean to live well? What does it mean to live in accordance with the world as it is given to us? Here is a 7th comment. In the first part of the Koro, the section on virtue, on ethics, Tiruvallur is clear that one of the highest aims of human life is achieved in domesticity, in the cultivation of households and communities of households that are able to be generous. For instance, in chapter 9 on hospitality, the first verse says that the aim of being at home, of being a householder, is this: the aim of cherishing and being at home, for cherishing guests with generosity. The life of cherishing and being at home, for cherishing guests with generosity. Now, the word here I've translated as generosity, interestingly, and I think very revealingly, also can mean the cultivation of soil. It also can mean agriculture. Verlanmai is the word in Tamil. And so even here we see that in Tamil, as in English, the possibility of generosity is connected to the possibility of generation, Only when we are able to generate abundance, to cultivate abundance of the earth, can we hope to be properly and truly generous. And this generosity, the generosity of the household, the generosity of a community of households rooted in generation, is for Tiruvallur the only reason somebody should become known, the only true reason for renown, for being famous, for being known for goodness, which leads to my 8th point about a verse which comes from chapter 101, back in the second part of the Qur'an, on fruitless wealth, on wealth that has gone awry. With all that we've spoken about so far, listen to this verse. Their birth burdens the earth, men hungry to earn, who seek no renown. Their birth burdens the earth, men hungry to earn, who seek no renown. That is, who seek no, who do not with their earnings seek to be generous, seek to be known for generosity, seek to be known for encompassing the whole community. Such a disconnection of economics from regard for goodness, from regard for generosity, rooted in caring for the possibility of generation, earthly generation. Such this disconnection burdens the earth itself, which I think is a profound insight. And it gets even stronger. This is my 9th comment. The stakes are even higher than that. For if Tiruvallur has many things to say about good governance, he also has many things to say about bad governance, harsh governance, governance that inspires fear. And on harsh and fearful governance, Tiruvallur has this to say. This is the 10th verse of chapter 57, striking no fear. Harsh rule that brings idiots together. Nothing burdens the earth more. Harsh rule that brings idiots together. Nothing burdens the earth more. And although this verse can easily stand on its own, I hope you can see that when we place it in the larger context of the Qur'an as a whole, with Tiruvallur's concern for genuine knowledge and genuine stupidity, genuinely good governance and governance to fear and to oppose, the wisdom of such a verse becomes all the more potent, all the more able to shake us from our complacency. For as we learn from the study of ecology, such a burden cannot be borne indefinitely. There are limits to what the earth can bear. This is this question of limits. Tiruvallur puts really unforgettably in a more playful verse from a chapter on knowing strength, where he says, "Even the axle of a cart of feathers breaks, if heaped with too many." I'll say it again. Even the axle of a cart of feathers breaks, if heaped with too many. Here again we see this exquisite sensitivity to limits. Even something that seems, we think of feathers as being so light, but when the proportion is out of balance, a single feather more will collapse the whole cart. And you'll also remember that other verse where, what is the axle of the world? The axle of the world are farmers. Hopefully you can start to see that in some ways, a work like this, each verse is also a commentary on all of the others, just as all of the other verses are commenting on each verse that we read. And a 10th comment. One last comment before we turn to some time for question and conversation. I've spoken of part 1 and of part 2, but not yet of part 3, on love, on romantic love, the love of lovers, the love of committed partners in life. And there are people who have thought that this part of the Qur'an doesn't actually somehow belong in the Koro. There are, in fact, a number of the early translations omitted this section altogether because they didn't think it was speaking to the same serious concerns of ethics and community life the first two sections speak of. But I would argue that such people have failed to read the work as a whole, have failed to attend to how all of its parts interconnect in a simultaneously lyric and philosophical vision and expression of goodness, and how this may be embodied in the nitty-gritty of daily life. So I'd like to end, at least this part of the presentation, with a verse from part 3 on love, and in fact from the very last chapter of the book. The last 3 chapters of the book are on sulking. Now, I had a friend that an artist friend who was reading the Tirukkural, reading my translation, and he said, I was amazed, this is a book that encompasses so many different aspects of life. And I wondered, where is it going to end? And then I got to the end of these 3 chapters on sulking, and he was a little surprised. He wasn't sure how that became the grand ending that he was expecting. And we were talking, and I said, this is what has occurred to me, is that what is sulking? It is when we're in it with someone, a marriage, a committed relationship. And inevitably, there are moments where things, misunderstandings arise. We take slights are perceived or are experienced, and people turn away. They sulk. So why would Tiruvallur have 3 chapters on sulking? Because sulking allows us to turn back again. It allows us to turn back again with new humility, with new insight into the other person, with new respect for the relationship as a whole. How do we really come to fit each other? So here is a verse from the last chapter, and it goes like this. Hearts joined like earth and water. What heaven transcends their sulking? Hearts joined like earth and water. What heaven transcends their sulking? It's an extraordinary verse, and it's extraordinary for many, many reasons. One of them being, here, just as in chapter 2, we're likening the rain to ambrosia, to the elixir of life. Here, sulking, this uncomfortable, confusing, bewildering experience at times, is likened to heaven. Why? Because it can bring us back together, especially if we have become joined. How? Like hearts joined like earth and water. So here too you can see how this same image is flowing through from beginning to end, how water and land come together to create the possibility of life. This poem also refers back to one of the great poems of the Sangam era, which we can also discuss in the Q&A if people are interested. But I would leave us with this thought, which is that have we not ourselves as human beings been sulking in relation to what feeds us and makes our very lives possible? Are we not guilty of having turned away from the possibility of a mutually healing and wholehearted relatedness with the ground beneath our feet and the heavens that rain down on us from above? May we all discover, each in our own way in community, how this reconciliation and reunion can lead us all back to the interrelated wholeness of which Tiruvallur so powerfully sings. Thank you for your attentive listening. And now we have, I understand, some time for Q&A.
That was amazing. I keep wanting to listen more from you. And thank you so much. So we'll start with some questions from the panel, and then we will move to questions from the audience. Nimi, you want to pose your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mati. Thomas, that was amazing. So that was my first insight into Tirukkural. It was very insightful. And so, by the way, I'm Nimi Arunachalam. I'm leading the Tamilar Arunachalam Tamil Sai Endowment with Tamil and Tamilar Diaspora Studies at FIU. So I'm curious, Thomas, what your journey was like in deciding to translate the Tirukkural, given that it has been translated many times before. So what was your decision? What was your journey like?
It's a wonderful question. I first studied the Tirukkural in 2003 and 2004 under a Fulbright fellowship. And at that time, I had one aim and one aim only, which was to enter the work as fully and deeply as I could, which I was living with my extraordinary Tamil teacher, Dr. Kuve Ramakodi, in his house in Madurai. And we read not just the original work, the Tirukkural, we read all of the 4 or 5 or 6 most important and oldest and most esteemed commentaries on the work. I also memorized some 600 or 700 of the poems, and I learned to write in the verse form of the Kural. But I never had the intention of translating it. I only wanted to enter the work, and I wanted to enter it with a kind of ecological understanding. I was interested in how language and land connect, how the ways that we speak about place and the ways that we speak about ourselves interconnect. But in the years since that period of intense study, I would speak with my teacher sometimes on the phone, and he would say things like, you know, Tom, somebody really ought to do a proper literary translation of the Tirukkural. To which I would say, yes, I think that would be a wonderful thing. And then he would say, and this person should, maybe they would use all of those old commentaries that you and I read together. Then you would have a wonderful translation. And I'd say, yes, let somebody come along and do such a thing. I really didn't have any idea that he was suggesting that I might carry out a translation, because in every other area of life, he had no hesitation to say, you do this, don't do that. But I think because he too was a poet, I think he understood you couldn't tell someone to do such an enormous project. You could only hint, you could only suggest and hope it might occur to someone in their own heart, because only then would it actually have any possibility of happening. Well, 12 years later, 2016, it finally did occur to me that I might give it a try. And I think in the interim, I'd been at this point deeply involved in an apprenticeship to language and to poetry, 16 years of really working at the craft of being a writer and being a poet. So I had, I think, a bit more confidence to think, well, maybe I'll try doing a translation. And so I started doing one verse a day, and I shared those with my teacher. And he said, oh my goodness, you finally got the hint. Now you get yourself back to Tamil Nadu. We'll look at your translation together. And I did. In 2017, I was blessed to be able to go back and have one last visit with my teacher. We went through the entire work. I thought, I had studied the Tirukkural. We actually read the entire thing again at even greater depth. And because his English was excellent, he would push me on my translation. And he'd say, he'd read my translation and say, you've got, okay, you have the meaning fairly good, but you have no life, or you have no verve. You need more pizzazz. You need that intensity. And he would bring me into his experience of the verse in Tamil, and I would try as best I could to convey that experience in English. Now, of course, another, as your comment rightfully acknowledges, there are many translations of Tirukkural, many translations. And yet, at the time when I began my translation, I applied for and was grateful to receive a National Endowment for the Arts translation grant. And I did research on all of these other translations. And I discovered that in North America in 2016, there was not a single translation into English of the Tirukkural in print. Now that's an astonishing fact. If you go into a bookstore, let alone a library, and you look for a translation of, say, the Tao Te Ching, you'll find a dozen excellent translations. Same thing with the Bhagavad Gita, or with the poetry of Rumi, or Confucius, or Plato's Republic. And yet here is a work, on par with these works of world literature, that for a variety of reasons is not well known in English. And I think one of the reasons, and the one that is very important to me, is that almost all of the previous translations into English have translated Tiruvalluvar's ideas, and they've been faithful enough. but they have not conveyed the energy or the experience of the poetry. And for anyone who knows Tamil, we know that they're reading Tirukkural, hearing the verses is itself an extraordinary experience. Otherwise they would just become a list of rules, and people don't remember lists of rules. People remember poems. People remember poetry, which takes an idea and infuses it with meaning through its very music, through the very rhythm of its lines, because this is how we are able to actually say more than the words say. And so my chief aim in my own translation has been to at least to try to convey something of that poetic experience, which I would argue is part of what is the meaning that is conveyed.
Very nice, lovely journey, taking us on that journey, Thomas. So there's a question from the audience, and then I'll come back to the panel. We heard about the wonderment of nature and the world around us. We heard about how we become a burden on the planet. Was there a call to action if that burden crosses a limit?
That's a wonderful question. I believe that, throughout the quote, not just in those verses, but throughout, there's a sense that there is a continual call to action that fits its context. So there's a continual call to action that keeps us even from getting close to the limit, let alone from crossing over into the kind of territory, unfortunately, I think, as a planet we find ourselves in today. So there's this there is this continual awareness of the interrelatedness of things and to the capacity of human beings, of the world itself, and that a good life of a person, like the good life of a community, is one that takes into account in all ways, how do we honor these proportions? How do we honor proportions in such a way that natural cycles are honored, for instance? How do we honor these proportions so that all human beings are given what they need to flourish, given what they need to learn? And so in some ways, the entire book is a continual call to action, a continual call to action that is informed by the way that the world actually works. I think particularly of the verse that I used, from which I took the title of the talk.
Can you say that in Tamil?
Ulagattodottu palakattrum kallar ariviladar. Aramana part.
So I want to turn to Professor Larson, who probably enjoyed this more than any one of us, and to pose his question.
Yes, thank you so much, Thomas. That was a wonderful presentation, and I echo what Kalai said. We could listen to you for many, many hours and still feel like we were just beginning. I want to follow up with Nimi's question, because I'm curious. We heard a little bit about your own background, but how did you get interested in Tamil in the first place? And was it through your study of philosophy, your love of literature? And then my other question kind of more follows with the last question. We hear so much about the situation of the Earth from a scientific standpoint. And even yesterday, I saw a report on the evening news about how the glaciers are disappearing and much more quickly than anybody had expected. But you seem to have recovered the idea that these traditions, these ancient traditions too, have something to teach us. It's not just kind of the mental, right, learning the science, but there's also a kind of an awakening that I think many of us experienced this morning as you were reading the poetry. And that's very important. Maybe you could speak between the connection between the two. And if you want to say the mind and the heart or something like that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, as far as how I came to study Tamil, it's a long story which I'll try to condense so that we have plenty of time. But the short version is that I actually didn't intend originally to learn Tamil. When I finished my undergraduate studies, I had the feeling that I needed to learn another language because I had been so intent on studying not just philosophy, but also I was studying environmental studies, that I hadn't had room in my schedule to study another language. But I came to see that as being a great lack, that if I can only think and speak in English, I can only think and speak in one conceptual framework, even if that conceptual framework includes many, sometimes competing frameworks. And so I set for myself the task immediately following graduation to learn another language. And I thought it would be Spanish, because Spanish is widely spoken in the United States, and because I had a very important mentor in southern Mexico, a great thinker, an activist involved with ecological as well as indigenous issues that I wanted to be able to converse with in Spanish. So I applied for and was a finalist for a fellowship. And because people said I had a good application, I didn't make any backup plans, and then I didn't receive it. And I thought my life was entirely over. It was kind of a devastating experience. And then an opportunity almost literally landed in my lap to go to, it was a 2.5-year fellowship to go to South India, to live in Tamil Nadu, to live in Madurai, to teach English, to study Tamil, and then also to, I would be given freedom and support to study anything else that might interest me. And since my plan for southern Mexico had been to live in a village and to learn something about rooted community life, a professor very astutely observed that, well, I could do such a thing in South India as well. And I spent a week fighting the possibility and wrestling, debating with myself about this. And then I had to admit to myself, not only was it, an extraordinary opportunity, but I had, ever since I was a child, had an interest in India. I don't know where it came from, but anytime I was asked to do a report, for instance, on a country, for world geography, for instance, I would choose India. And so I had this interest. And so I took up this fellowship and went for the first time, in this case, to Madurai. And I lived in a village, which was very crucial for my learning of the language, particularly my ability to speak and understand spoken Tamil, which in some ways is quite different from written and literary Tamil. But at the time I had no intention to study literary Tamil or literature. I was very much interested in this on-the-ground exploration of sort of ecological, agricultural village life. But it was my teacher who was able to really cultivate a love for the language and encourage me to learn to read and write, so I could, for instance, be able to write to him after I left, write to him and his wife, whom I would call Amma, came to call Amma, and be able to write to them. He also had me memorize the poems of a 12th century Tamil woman poet and saint named Alvayar. And memorizing these poems and listening to the music of those poems really was a turning point in my life, because it reminded me of language not merely as an intellectual construct, but also as a musical, sensual experience that we can particularly enjoy in poetry. And so when I returned after those initial 2.5 years to English, I could suddenly hear English in a way I'd never heard it before. And I could enjoy poetry, which had been kind of an opaque thing to me, not particularly interesting to me, confusing to me until that point. I could suddenly enjoy poetry in a way I hadn't enjoyed, at least maybe not since I was a child. And so Tamil, in fact, returned me to something essential in myself and strengthened at that point, the decision I took to dedicate my life to words and to writing and to poetry. And so I've been on that apprenticeship and that adventure ever since. And I did actually get to go on and study Spanish as well. So I work with Tamil and English and Spanish. I also love and appreciate this second question that you asked about, we can look at the scientific reports about the state of affairs in the world, which are of course quite grim, I think, if we take them very seriously. And I would say that there's something about that very grimness, that very sense of being overwhelmed, that really is where the question of where do we find the strength to look at these things, let alone to act in such a way that some of the impending disasters might be averted. Where do we find that moral energy, if you will? Where do we find that spiritual grounding, to use a different kind of term? Because without some kind of foundation in a larger moral vision, we sort of become overwhelmed by such information, or we just ignore it. I mean, this is the great predicament. You know, if we take seriously all these things and we have no moral resources, we just sort of collapse. Or we collapse and we say, well, I'll just go on with my life because what could I possibly do about these things that are so big? And I think that something that our time does is it forces us to look back on some of our traditions. We can do the same thing with someone like Plato or Aristotle, or even the pre-Socratics, and say, you know, what were they saying to us that maybe we didn't hear fully? How might they, in tandem, in concert with our current scientific knowledge, how might they help us to find answers to questions that are not merely scientific, but are also moral, ethical, cultural, spiritual, even psychological as well? And so I find in a work like Tirukural, in a poet like Tiruvalluvar, an extraordinary wealth of insight into the human and more than human aspect of our striving to live well in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. And I find an extraordinary conversation partner that I get to be in dialogue with through this extraordinary work, and a conversation partner that we can put in conversation with, say, with a Plato or with a Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, and these other things, so that we can draw upon the great riches of philosophical, of moral, of ethical insight, which can strengthen us, which can indeed strengthen our hearts to be able to respond with wisdom, with compassion, and with care to what we are clearly being asked to respond to.
Thank you, Thomas. So I'm going to rephrase or paraphrase a question that was in Q&A. You know, one thing that I noticed from your speech is, from your Kartarang, is that how you managed to find the flow between these three chapters and bring it together. And that is something, you know, I find that is not always, doesn't always exist. And this is why you and I talked about research area, how we can do that. So when was the moment you realized how to connect these three chapters on a topic such as, you know, saving the earth, essentially, right? What do we leave behind? What are footprints? And how has that impacted you as well?
That's a wonderful question. When I took up my teacher's suggestion to translate the work, I not only went back to all of those commentaries, but I also had to look at how each verse sits against another. Because, you know, if I translate a word from chapter 72 in such and such a way, and that same word appears in chapter 3, then I have to ask myself, do I want to translate the same word in the same way in both chapters, or is that same word being used slightly differently, and would that necessitate a different English translation? All of these kinds of questions were raised for me. And so I found that I had to learn to read, as I say, ecologically, you know, being able to look at each verse as a kind of independent entity, or an entity that can stand on its own, and at the same time is in conversation with all of the other verses around it. And because that's where the real richness of the work appears. You know, in the Western context, the usual genre, or the usual the way we read or write philosophy is as prose. That this is the sort of historical convention, with the exception of, say, philosophers like, say, Wittgenstein, who will write in aphorisms. And I think there's a lot to be said about, say, Wittgenstein and Tiruvalluvar, another topic, for instance, for research and conversation. But the poetic form, I think, demands something of us that is different from what a prose form, discursive form demands of us. Poetic form demands of us to be supremely engaged, supremely attentive, and to be able to make connections so that we realize that, for instance, the way that the Tirukkural is arranged into chapters itself becomes a kind of commentary. Where a verse appears in the work as a whole, in a chapter, in a section, becomes part of the meaning that is conveyed, becomes part of the a kind of silent commentary, if you will, on the verse. And so, in a way, the work itself taught me to read in a way that is synthetic, would be the sort of fancy word for it, that integrates these different aspects. And so I become, fascinated by how the image of water flowing flows through the entire work. We can also look at the way the question of fit and appropriateness, scale, informs all the way through. And this is where the work really rewards a reader, which is why we've been reading it for centuries and centuries, because it nourishes us, and it nourishes indeed not just our knowledge, but our capacity to read, our capacity to listen, our capacity to integrate many areas of experience. I was recently in Singapore for the Tamil Language Festival there. I just returned. And when people would ask me about, what would you say to young people about why is this work so important? And of course, I would talk about, say, this ecological sensibility, for instance, but also talk about that here is a work which insists on wholeness, which insists on looking at the entire realm, the entire range of human experience and say, what does it mean to live a complete life? What does it mean to live a life that integrates all of these aspects? So again, the whole is bringing together, together our capacity to bring together things that may seem sort of disparate and separate.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas. And, there are a lot of comments about how complete is your, and how you have completely have caught the essence of the choral and also able to convey it. He can convey it both in Tamil and English, will be another hour. But with the interest of time, we will go to the closing side of the event. But we will we'll have him back, and we'll have him part of our initiative at FIU. Perasrier Larsen அவர்கள் ஸ்டீவன் ஜே கிரீன் ஸ்கூல் ஆஃப் இன்டர்நேஷனல் அண்ட் பப்ளிக் அஃபேர்ஸ் சமய ஆய்வுத்துறை தலைவராக உள்ளார். பேராசிரியர் லார்சன் அவர்கள் சிரக்கூஸ் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் பிஎஸ் பட்டமும் நியூயார்க் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் முனைவர் பட்டமும் பெற்றவர். புதிய ஏற்பாடு, கிறிஸ்தவ தோற்றம், பண்டைய யூத மதம், சாக்கடல் சுருள்கள் ஆகியவற்றில் நிபுணத்துவம் பெற்றவர். இவர் FIU-வில் பல பாடங்களை கற்றுக் கொடுக்கிறார். இஸ்லாம் பற்றியும் கிறிஸ்துவ மதத்தை பற்றியும் உலக மதங்கள் பற்றியும் வகுப்புகள் கற்பித்து வருகிறார். விரைவில் தமிழ் மொழியையும் கற்றுத் தருவார் என நம்புகிறோம். இம்முன்முயற்சியின் தொடக்கத்திலே பேராசிரியர் அவர்களை அணுகிய போது அவர்களின் ஆதரவு மிகவும் பெரிது, அளவிடா இயலாதது. அதற்காக மிகவும் பெரும் கடமைப்பட்டிருக்கிறேன். இந்த அமர்வு, இந்த கருத்தரங்கு பேராசிரியர் அவர்களின் அர்ப்பணிக்கு ஒரு சான்றாகும். தொடக்க நிகழ்வு பேராசிரியர் லார்சன் வரவேற்கிறேன். Please welcome Professor Larsen to this inaugural event of Karutharangu to say a few words.
Thank you very much. First, I want to give special thanks to our speaker, Thomas. This was an amazing, wonderful presentation. We couldn't have hoped better for the inaugural lecture in the Valuvar series. It's a joy when you experience a conversation, simple things in life, but you kind of can joy in communicating with someone else and sharing hearts and minds. You, through your lecture today, you have taught us of the joy of experiencing the great thoughts of ancient teachers. And what an experience it has been. I think if anyone in the audience went to the poetry reading by Professor Hart, both of you have really shown us what it can mean to spend time with great thinkers and great thoughts, and how it can move and change our lives. So thank you for that. I feel awakened. I feel happy in my soul, and thank you for what you have given to us today. I want to thank everyone who's in attendance. It's so wonderful to see the audience, hear your questions and your thoughts. We really appreciate your attendance at these events, and you show us that we're onto something here. You know, you always think if you're doing an initiative, is it going to reach people? And you have showed us that it does. And we look forward to everyone who sees this through the recording. And we're so happy that this will go out and be available to many people, and I hope many people will avail themselves of it. At the university at this time, we are finishing the school year. Our students are beginning final exams here. They're getting ready to reach their goals. Many of them are graduating, others are progressing in their studies. And, you know, one of the joys of working at an academic institution is to see young people who have so much potential, and they could really address these issues that we're laying in front of them, take this up and really change their own lives and change the world as well. And with that, I want to move in thanks at the end to Professor Kalai Mathi. It's really just incredible to see what you have done through your energy, your vision. She is the founding director and the founder of Tamil and Tamil Diaspora Studies. And I'm just so thankful to work with you every day, Kalai. Your dedication and what an incredible year we've had with the lecture series all across the board and the performances. It's just been more than I could have dreamed for kind of our first official year, but we've made such good progress. And with friends like Thomas and scholars and with listeners like all of you, I know that we'll go on and do even better things. So stay tuned for our next year. And we really look forward to seeing you at all the events of the Tamil and Tamil Diaspora Studies Initiative. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Professor Mathi.
A sincere thanks to Professor Larson for that. And my personal thanks to you for all that, for being such a positive influence in whatever I do in this program. My sincere heartfelt gratitude to Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma for accepting our invitation and absolutely flooring us with the lecture. We acknowledge Mr. Carlos Aguedo for his patient assistance with media operations, Mr. Tamil Chilian for creating the posters, and Mrs. Susila Manikam for her translations. Our events can be found at the Department of Religious Studies website, as well as Tamil and TamilarDiaspora.org. நிகழ்வு முடிவுரையை அளித்த பேராசிரியர் லார்சன் அவர்களுக்கு எனது இதயபூர்வமான நன்றிகள். எங்களின் அன்பு அழைப்பை ஏற்று எங்களை முழுமையாக விரிவுரையில் ஏற்றியதற்காக திரு தாமஸ் ஹிட்டோஷி புருக்ஸ்மாவுக்கு எனது மனமார்ந்த நன்றி. எங்கள் அமர்வு நிகழ்வுகளை டிபார்ட்மெண்ட் ஆஃப் ரிலிஜியஸ் வெப்சைட், துறை வெப்சைட் மற்றும் தமிழ் அண்ட் தமிழர் diaspora.org இணைய வலையில் காணலாம். திரு கலைமாமணி சிக்கல் குருச்சரின் நிகழ்ச்சி மே 6 அன்று 4 மணிக்கு புளோரிடா இன்டர்நேஷனல் யூனிவர்சிட்டி கேம்பஸில் நடைபெறும். தயவு செய்து நேரடியாக வந்து கலந்து கொள்ள அனைவரையும் வருக வருக என்று அழைக்கிறேன். நீங்கள் ஏதாவது ஒரு வகையில் பங்கேற்கவோ அல்லது உதவவோ விரும்பினால் எனது மின்னஞ்சலுக்கு ஒரு செய்தி அனுப்புங்கள். இவ்வளவு நேரம் எங்களுடன் இணைந்ததற்கு நன்றி. நன்றி, வணக்கம். மீண்டும் சந்திப்போம். இன்பமே சூழ்க. எல்லோரும் வாழ்க.